I'm going to remove your screen here just because until we start. Okay, Rick, if you want to share a screen, can you see at the bottom in that center bar where it has share?
Yeah.
If you click on that, it gives you a range of options where you can share like another screen, and it'll just give you options to select what screen you want to share on there, and it won't interrupt your camera screen.
And then it's asking about recording.
Don't worry about the recording.
Okay. Let's see. I think I want to do that one. Let's see. Share. What do you see, if anything? You don't yet, do you?
I don't yet.
Chrome has lost permission to capture your screen. Unlock the screen by selecting lock on the bottom. Oh, let's try that. Let's try that again. Let's see. Share screen. Yep, it says it's got it locked. Okay, so hang on here. It says quit and reopen. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Got you.
Well, let's try it again.
All right. Okay, I gotcha. I'm going to add this to the stream.
Okay, and this is what we want.
Yeah. So this is you and I talking, and when I turn it over to you, I'm just going to switch it over to this view here. Except I'm going to take myself. It'll just be you in the bottom corner there.
Okay. Well, I don't even see anything except my slides now. So.
Okay.
Because I'm in the slideshow mode on PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. All right. Hey, Andy.
Hey.
All right. We are now live. We're going to give just like a couple of minutes for folks to join in, but we got everybody up here.
Okay, we got Jane joining us too, right?
Jane may or may not be. She's struggling with internet issues, so if we need to, I will sub in, or we can cover Friday's event. But she's
very good.
She's straining with internet. She's frantic. All right,
and
I'm gonna.
Chris Keeley.
Chris did not say that he did not have anything to report today from the studio.
Okay.
Another minute. Trevor, I can see you're on YouTube. Can you hear us, see us okay? give us a thumbs up or. Trevor, I can see you're on YouTube. Can you hear us? Give us a thumbs up or. All right, guys. Well, it's 6:02, so we're gonna get it going here. We're gonna fill the screen. Cool. Thanks, guys. Stan and Trevor, appreciate you guys. We're just gonna quiet this really fast. All right, guys. Thanks for coming. My name's Daniel. I'm a board member of the TED Trueblood chapter of Trout Unlimited, based here in Boise, Idaho. And tonight's a really exciting show. Rick Williams is with us. Rick is an icon and a bit of a legend in the salmon, steelhead, anadromous history of the Northwest, and someone that I've studied a lot. And this is a project and a campaign that I work on every day in conservation, as well as many of us here on this chat have. But none of us have done it quite as well and for quite as long as Rick, and we all have a lot to learn. But quickly, we are going to cover some club business before we get going. So I am going to start on behalf of Jane, our youth program committee leader. We have an event coming up on Friday, and you'll have to excuse me. I'm going to read my notes here. There's going to be 100 youth, which are going to be participating in a fly casting course, and specifically casting. And this is going to be at Esther Simplot Park on Friday. We're asking everyone to arrive at 8 a.m. The kids will be casting until approximately 1 p.m. We are in desperate need of volunteers, and we are really looking for earnest help of the fly fishing community to enrich the youth's lives there at the park through learning to fly fish and all the aspects. There's a fantastic PE teacher, which is really building this in to the young folks here in Boise, and we really want to support that. So if you are available, please email me directly. I'll just give you my email. It's easy. I'm responsible for it. It's ritz.danny.a ritz.danny.a@gmail, and I'll make sure that Jane gets those. Really hope you guys can make it. It's going to be a great event. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our club president, Daryl Kirk, to introduce us for general club business. Daryl, you there?
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Daryl Kurt. I am the current president of the Trout Unlimited chapter of TED Trueblood chapter of Trout Unlimited. Wow, that's a great way to start. The past couple of years have been quite a challenge, what with the pandemic and limitations about gathering in groups, etc. However, the chapter has stayed active, and we've got quite a lot going on. We've managed to continue doing some online presentations like you're about to watch tonight. We've done several of them throughout the year. We're going to take a break for the summer to encourage you all to get outside, enjoy the outdoors. And we've got some folks that are going to tell you about lots of opportunities that you can get involved with some environmental stewardship, conservation work with the TED Trueblood Trout Unlimited chapter. And there are going to be several opportunities that will be right here in town in Boise. And you'll hear more about those in a moment. But all in all, just like environmental work, nature, pandemic, challenges come in every direction, in every shape and size. We want to thank you for joining us tonight. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Andy Brunel.
Sorry, Daryl.
Hey,
Just make sure at the end.
Dan, you hear me okay?
Gotcha.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to cover a couple of items for the chapter this evening, and we've been working on a couple of conservation projects for a couple of years, and I just got back an hour or so ago. I drove out East Boise out to the Harris Ranch area and the lower part of Warm Springs Creek that flows into the Boise River is it's at flood stage. That's a small stream that goes into the Boise River, basically opposite of Barber Park from the north side. And We did some planting there first in 2020, and then came back in March of 2021. And then this past winter, we had students from Riverstone Elementary, or Riverstone School, high school students mainly, and some junior high, as well as students from One Stone who have worked on some of the riparian planting and trying to help form the channel. And so today just went out there to take a quick look to see what happened. And as you might expect, all that precipitation Monday has really put a pulse of water into the stream from the foothills into the Boise River. So it's flowing water pretty nice right now. And the cottonwood trees that we planted in March as a club, and the willow that the Riverstone students planted in December are starting to leaf out. So we're hoping for good growing conditions this year. And this latest precipitation and cooler weather is a really nice addition to that. So that's one of our projects here in the Boise area that we're working on. The other I just wanted to mention is we are working with the Idaho Water Project Office of Trout Unlimited, and we involved a lot of other organizations and government agencies in putting together a proposal. We are hoping to get support, financial support from the Bureau of Reclamation under the Water Smart program to really get after some of the issues on the South Fork of the Boise River. Maybe through forming a work group or collaborative effort on the South Fork. And we submitted that proposal in early April, went into the Bureau of Reclamation. I don't expect to hear any definitive feedback from them until later in the summer. But we are hoping for support from the agency for a grant that would help initiate a watershed group to focus on some of those issues on the lower South Fork of the Boise. And like you, I have seen the great increase in recreational use along the South Fork. We went through the period with the fires in 2013 and some recovery since then. Our activities down there to do some reconnect projects like we did at Pierce Creek and some of the riparian plantings have sort of been on the back burner for a few years, but we want to get back into that. And we think the best approach to that would be a collaborative way with other groups, landowners, agencies, other interested parties. So just wanted to let chapter folks know that we are working on that as well. Dan, I think those were the two things I wanted to cover this evening, and thanks for the time to at least update people on those two conservation activities.
All right. All right. Can you hear me now? Not? Daniel, I'm trying to speak, but I don't think you hear me. I just want to make sure that everybody knows that we are having this fun youth event with North Junior High. This is an event that I have participated in over the last 4 or 5 years, and it is really a fun one. It definitely grew in size this year, and the format has changed a bit. Thursday, we're having a casting on the grass lessons all day long. If you're interested, stop by at North Junior High at the football field and help us just support kids with their casting. And then the big need is actually on Friday, and when we're going to be at Esther Simplot Park. 100 kids are going to go fly fishing at Simplot Park. And I stopped by North today and met with a lot of the kids. They are so excited about this event. It will be fun. So stop by. It starts at 8 o'clock. And even if you can come for a couple hours, it'd be great. So hope to see some of you. Thanks. Bye.
I'm muted. That's why everybody was doing that. Friday, we're looking for volunteers. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Friday, we're looking for volunteers. Jane, I gave out my email. So everybody, again, Friday, Esther Simplot. Appreciate all of you that are interested. And with that, we're going to end our club business. And we are going to introduce our guest. Rick Williams has been working on the Columbia River watershed and specifically the decline and our populations of salmon returning up the Columbia to Idaho literally since I was born. I was born in 1987, and I'm looking here at my fun fact one sheet propped up behind my computer. You've been working on it since then. I work full-time in communications, and this is a project that I work on a daily basis and that I have personal and professional interest in. And for someone to walk the walk and talk the talk as Rick has, and he's a humble guy, so he won't give you this, but I'll lay it on thick for you. Rick has contributed as much as any of us could hope to contribute to a project like this. He's written a fantastic book. I believe it was the mid 2000s that was released. Can't suggest that enough. I can't say anything that he is not going to supersede in authority. And with that, I want to hand it over to Rick Williams, a local and someone that I'm honored to work with folks on a daily basis, from everything from the governor's office to regional coalitions that he has influenced and will continue to for decades to come. So with that, Rick, thank you very much for being here. Thank you everyone for attending. And if you have any questions, put them into the comments. I can see everything coming through. And Rick, as we talked about, if there seems to be a timely question at an appropriate time, I'll just kind of jet in and let you know that, somebody from here has got this question, if that's all right with you. And with that, I'm going to add your screen and take off my stupid face, and you're off to the races.
All right. Thank you, Dan. That'd be great. Go ahead and interrupt with timely questions, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end, because I know this is a huge topic. And just FYI, we're actually working on another book right now with my longtime friend and colleague, Jim Ligatowicz, who wrote the fabulous Salmon Without Rivers book. And so that's probably about a year out, but I'll keep people posted on that. So I'm going to jump into a PowerPoint slide program. It's got 50 slides, which we're going to work through pretty quickly. It's got a ton of information. I saw a lot of you last week at the great TU event down at the Riverside when Chris Wood was here. It was great to see Chris. And he talked about the importance of Lower Snake Dam removal at a really high level and some of the political aspects of it. I'm going to kind of give you the science and the nuts and bolts behind that. It gets us to the same place, and I'm sure we'll entertain some of the same questions. So this presentation I gave a month or so, 6 weeks ago, over to Sun Valley, to the Hemingway chapter, a real enthusiastic response. And it's a condensation of a bigger, longer talk that Russ Thoreau, Idaho's kind of preeminent Chinook salmon biologist up out of Salmon, Idaho. He's been with the Rocky Mountain Research Station with the Forest Service for a long time. So this is kind of our baby, and I owe a lot of it to Russ. And then you'll see there'll be a number of slides in there that Helen Neville and Dan DeWalter and the crew from Trout Unlimited helped develop as well, that are all part of we're all working on this together. So Columbia River Basin, historically the most productive salmon habitat in the world, also the most hydro-developed salmon habitat in the world. And as you can imagine, there's a bit of a conflict there. That statement comes directly from our 2006 book, Return to the River. And today, wild fish numbers in the basin are about 1 to 2% of what Lewis and Clark observed when they came through the basin. So two of my heroes, of course, I'm sure for many of you others, here's the historical range and abundance outlined in the larger purple and red, showing the Columbia River and how much of it is embedded in the Snake River system that goes up into Idaho. So Lewis, really reading their journals, it's incredible. They got to the confluence of the salmon, the Snake and the Columbia River, and they could see 60 to 80 feet down into the river. And they were going down there in the early to mid fall, and they saw shoals of salmon in the river, which is hard to get my head around today, but really cool. We estimate that 10 to 16 million salmon came back to the entire Columbia River system annually. Several of us think that that may actually be an underestimate given the productivity of a lot of the habitats in southwest Idaho and also the salmon in Clearwater. But today, and out of that, about 2 to 6 million salmon came out of the Snake River Basin. So here's another shot of the Snake River Basin showing you the dams and the basin. Everything in red is habitat that salmon used to have access to historically, but has been blocked. You can see in Washington up here, Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee block access into here and a whole 1,000-kilometer loop up further into Canada. Of course, Dworshak blocks the North Fork of the Clearwater, which was a very productive one. And then the Hells Canyon complex blocked all of southwest Idaho, the Boise, the Payette, Jarbidge, Bruno, Waihe, those river systems. It wasn't an intentional block, but it worked out that way. The Snake Basin produces only about 19% of the Columbia River Basin flow, but historically produced about 55% of the summer steelhead, 45% of the summer Chinook, and 39% of the spring Chinook. So you can see it was disproportional in terms of its productivity. And these are all really important life histories that don't exist anywhere else in the basin. All of them still exist, but they're kind of hanging on by their toenails, so to speak. Here's another slide, just shows you these fish in Idaho are remarkable. No other fish travels so far or spawns at such high elevation habitats. And they have the ability to adapt to a changing environment. They spawn at the highest elevations of any salmon in the world, 6,000 to 7,000 feet up in the Stanley Basin. And another friend, Russ, has a friend who calls these fish both mariners and mountaineers because of their migrations in the freshwater environment and also their migrations in the marine environment. They're culturally and economically and historically very important to the basin, as you can see from the historical photo of the Native Americans fishing. They were nutritionally essential to the Native Americans, and an entire trade had developed through the entire Northwest, with tribes moving and migrating to the traditional salmon fishing sites, and there was a significant barter and exchange system for salmon versus other tools and clothing and essentials. They're iconic to the Pacific Northwest. Think about how many places you drive around in Idaho, and particularly over in Oregon and Washington, are named the Chinook Inn or the Salmon, whatever. And then, of course, down at the bottom, there's a historical photo of folks with a catch of Chinook salmon, it looks like, and it's hard to even imagine that today. Biologically, they are extraordinary animals. They're ecologically essential keystone animals in the ecosystems they're in. And for any of you who know anything about Idaho geology and water chemistry, central Idaho, the high elevation area that we all love in the Frank Church, is part of the Idaho batholith, and it's an oligotrophic river system. And oligotrophic is just a technical word that means very limited nutrients. So there's not a lot of nutrients in those systems, in contrast to a river system like the Madison or the Henry's Fork that has a lot of limestone and a lot of nutrients in the water that drives those ecosystems over there, which is why we all love trout fishing there. But in central Idaho, those don't exist. And it's the salmon that brought all the marine-derived nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, from their years in the ocean back into those systems. And it drove the ecosystems in that high elevation area that's mostly absent now. Salmon are remarkable for their diversity, and their diversity expresses itself in all kinds of different ways. Their physical morphology, their life history diversity, their plasticity, which is their adaptability to explore new habitats, find new ways to survive and make it work. And they're also diverse genetically. All of those things contribute to, when abundance is higher, stability and resilience. And resilience is the ability or capacity to absorb environmental variation or shocks or things without it really perturbing the population. The right side of the slide shows their life history, but we're going to go through it here real quick anyway. The adults, as you can see, would come back to the high elevation habitats with good spawning gravel, create reds, spawn, bury eggs, and then these are beautiful little organisms here are the baby salmon called alevins, and then they turn into fry, live among the rocks, and eventually turn into par, which are the small salmon or trout-like fish that we see. Then they'll spend anywhere from half a year to several years in the river system before they go through a process called smoltification, turn into smolts, and then head downriver. Let's see. I want to get that little thing out of there if I can. Okay. And get back to here. Okay. All of that occurs in their natal habitat, which is their spawning habitat in the freshwater systems, and in Idaho, generally up in the high elevation countries. They also have a marine portion of their life. Starts with the smolts moving downriver out into the marine environment. Well, they'll spend anywhere from half a year to many years, and then come back into freshwater as adults and spawn. A couple of things. So that's the marine portion of their lives. We use that transition between those for a metric we're going to talk a lot about tonight, and it's how we kind of measure returns and measure their reproductive success, how well they're doing. It's a survival measure that we call an SAR. That's the acronym. It stands for Smolt to Adult Return Ratio. And in the simplest terms, out of a pair of fish that mate, spawn, and produce young, 100 of the smolts produced from that go out to the ocean, and then the SAR is how many come back. And right now we're running somewhere between less than 1 to maybe 2. We need to be higher than that, as you'll see. The Snake River, historically, we had about a 1.5 million Chinook come back, another historical photo. And in 1995, we had 1,167 come back. 99% decline from historic levels. And how did this manage to happen? Well, it's the usual sort of causes. You all heard about the 4 H's, the development of the hydroelectric system, long-term overharvest of Columbia River Basin stocks. And we'll go through that in some more detail. Hatcheries, shifting production from the river systems themselves into hatcheries, and the consequences that have come out of that choice. And then habitat development, human population growth, habitat development and fragmentation throughout the basin. All of those contributed to the decline. So looking at it now, what's left in the Snake River Basin? So here's the blockage down here in southern Idaho. They used to get up to Shoshone Falls. We've lost all of this habitat. We've also lost the North Fork of the Clearwater. But we have remaining more than 3,000 miles of good to excellent habitat. And so how are wild Chinook trends in this habitat? So we're going to use Chinook as for a lot of what we look at tonight. Many of you are probably like me. You're probably a little more nuts about steelhead, but the numbers really track. So the Chinook are a good surrogate and slightly more sensitive to the trends than steelhead. So just as an aside. So here's Snake River wild spring Chinook salmon over the 57-year period up to, this is the Idaho Fish and Game data set. And you can see the dams going in, and you can see the Endangered Species Act, which went in 1991. And during the time period from 92 to 99, all the anadromous fish that come back to Idaho have been listed as threatened or endangered. Sockeye, spring, summer Chinook, fall Chinook, and steelhead. It's worth mentioning that we had a coho that used to come back to the Snake River, but it went extinct back about 1986, 87 area. So that was all, that decline was coincident with the 4 the completion of the 4 Snake River dams. So a few years ago, 2016, the action agencies, which are in charge of running the system and trying to do salmon recovery, and the action agencies are represented by these 3 acronyms down here: COE, Corps of Engineers; BPA, Bonneville Power Administration; BOR, Bureau of Reclamation. So they went around, and I'm sure many of you, like myself, were at the open house they held down at the Grove Hotel. And we went down there, and this is the slide they showed us of how wild Chinook were doing. And it actually doesn't look too bad. Here we are in 1990, and you can see a lot of variation in the blue, but climbing trend. That's the smooth trend, the abundance level, and then here's the 4-year average. And so you're thinking, well, not great, but things are going up. Well, here's the longer time span. So the bottom line here is that time scale matters. Here's Snake River wild Chinook salmon from 1957 to 2017. This is the Idaho Fish and Game data set. There's the section that we were shown at the CSIRO briefings, CRSO briefings. Here's the longer data set. And so the moral of this one is the time series shown on the graph can influence the interpretations. There's the trend line in the CRSO data, but here's the trend line that we see from during the previous time period. So this is a phenomenon called shifting baselines, where with each generation, the natural resource numbers drop and the expectation for ecological conditions shifts downwards, because the older generation knew there were greater numbers, but they declined. The new generation comes in with declined numbers. That lowered number becomes the baseline that they're familiar with, and that they operate on. The resource continues to decline, gradually goes down, without anybody kind of really paying attention to the long-term decline. So we can look at a longer time scale. We actually don't have salmon numbers from the Columbia River over that time because we didn't have dams, we weren't counting them, but we do have harvest history, and that gives us a picture of what's going on. This is Chinook harvest again from 1866 all the way through till about the 90s or so. And you can see this is a period that we've kind of called decline and extinction, and that's the 1957 to 1990. And remember, in the above 2000 peaks up a little bit, but still very down low. Those dams were built on the main stem during this time period. And then there's a longer time period. Whoops, let's go back here. And so you can see, and then the big peak right here in 1988 or so, or 1888 or so, what happened here is that previous in this portion of the slide here from 1866, salmon were a perishable commodity. This is where canning technology developed. And so boom, the harvest happened, and the fish were harvested and shipped all over the country. And there's a long period of very high sustained harvest before this period of decline that coincided with the dams being built. And then up in here with the right at the far right of the graph, right here's where the ESA listings occurred. So let's take a little closer look at hydro. Each dam encountered impacts juvenile salmon and steelhead. There's loss at each dam. And when you go through 8 of them, 76% of the juvenile salmon that pass through the Columbia River hydro system die as a result of injury or stress incurred while migrating. And that's from a paper by Howard Schaller. Howard and Idaho Fish and Game's Charlie Petrosky have co-authored a whole series of really important papers that we'll talk about a little bit more that tell us a lot of what's going on in the hydro system and the impact of the hydro system on juvenile survival and mortality. So here's the hydro system. You can see there's 4 dams on the Columbia River right here before the Snake River comes off, 4 on the Snake, and then 5, 6, 7 more up on the Columbia. But these, for Idaho, these are the ones we're concerned about. And this is from the NMFS, National Marine Fisheries Service 2016 Draft Recovery Plan. And it says federal hydropower projects in the lower Columbia and Snake River remain a primary threat to the viability of Snake River, spring, summer Chinook, and steelhead. So there it is, as bold as can be. So let's take a little closer look at Snake River Chinook. So here's SARs again. This is a little bit of a busy slide. One of the 2% SAR is what we call a maintenance or survival threshold. We talked about a pair mating and having juveniles, 100 smolts going out. Obviously, it takes 2 adults coming back to replace the 2 adults that created that brood. So that's the minimum threshold. The Power Council has a goal of SARs of 4% as they're kind of where they want to get to in terms of salmon returns and rebuilding. NIMS has about a 6% rebuilding goal. So the regional goals for SARs to foster rebuilding and recovery fall in that 4 to 6% range. And during the 1960s, back to Idaho, which was prior to completion of all the lower Snake River dams, we were getting Chinook back at 3.5 to 6.5% SARs. Steelhead were a little higher than that. And some of you may have had a chance to see those old movies that were circulated within the last couple of years about Ted Trueblood going into Hell's Canyon and steelhead fishing, and we all probably wish we could have been on that trip. There were plenty of fish there, even though they're very much lower than historical. There were a lot of fish in the system then, and in some ways that's kind of the goal we're aiming at for the near term for Idaho recovery. Since Lower Granite filled, Chinook SARs are often below 1%, and in 2000 to 2017 averaged about 0.7% SAR, so well below even maintaining themselves. Okay, so let's look specifically at Chinook salmon. These are the dams. So the dams in order: Bonneville's the first one, the Dalles is the second one, John Day is the third one, McNary is the fourth one. So here we are. This is John Day, McNary, and then we don't have any data on dams 5, 6, and 7. These are dams in the Lower Snake River Canyon because there's no tributary systems that come off it. So the measure up here is Lower Granite Dam. So let's look at there's the SARs for Chinook salmon, the time period 2000 to 2017. You can see they're above maintenance threshold, and there they are for the Snake River. There's the maintenance threshold and the rebuilding one. So Chinook are having a tough time in general, but particularly in the Snake Basin. Here's this wonderful slide that Trout Unlimited helped develop. And again, it shows the Snake River system all in red here. Snake River 8 dams, SARs 9% back to Bonneville, 0.8%. I said 0.9% to Bonneville, 0.8% to Lower Granite. So we don't even get to 1% SAR. So the populations are declining and not replacing themselves. And steelhead is kind of the same story. We have some data down at the Dalles, but it's really the same story. 5% back to the Deschutes, 4.9 SARs to John Day, 4 to Yakima, 1.35 to the Snake Basin. There's the thresholds again. And then the similar slide for steelhead from Trout Unlimited, showing us 1.3% SAR returns to Lower Granite, again below replacement. Doing a little better than Chinook, although not last year, but still essentially not replacing themselves. They're on a downward spiral. So if we look more closely at Chinook reds in the middle fork of the salmon, and this is an area where Russ Thoreau has spent a lot of his work. And here's a time period from 1995 to 2018, and you can see in 1995 very few fish. This is a map of the tributaries and main stem of the middle fork of the salmon, and the red dots represent where in their annual surveys they observed Chinook salmon reds. So some up in Marsh Creek and Valley Creek, Bear Valley Creek, and then here on one of the years in 2001, we had a spike of fish come back in 2001, 2, and 3, and you can see it kind of fills up. Great news. A mean of an average over all of this great variability of 771 reds. So there's the long term from 57 back. There's that spike in 2001 or so, which is right here. So we had a combination of good water years, so the smolts were able to go down out of Idaho. fairly quickly and unimpeded to the ocean, and we had good ocean food web conditions and temperature, so the fish survived very well and they came back great, at least for that time period. But you notice they just dropped right away. So that building wasn't sustained. That's worrisome. There was back in the 80s and 90s, the hypothesis was that we had underseeded habitat in Idaho. We weren't getting enough fish back. So the solution was needed more fish. And of course, the way to do that was hatcheries. But I would say that based on just these wild fish returns, if underseeded habitat was the problem and we got 3 years in a row of lots of fish, then this is what you'd expect to see. You'd expect to see bar graphs that were up in this range here since we filled up the habitat, and it ought to continue. But in fact, we see this. And so what that tells us is that what's controlling those returns are factors they're low SARs, and they're caused by factors that are out of the basin. They're not the result of underseeded habitat in Idaho, but mortalities and problems getting fish back to Idaho, out of the system and then back to Idaho. So those problems are down further in the river. And here's one of them, of course. And this is a quote: "The fish cannot survive the twin monsters of dams and climate change." This is from Steve Pettit. I'm sure a lot of you know Steve. I just talked with him yesterday. He's lived up on the Clearwater, and he's been a huge advocate for wild salmon and steelhead in Idaho for a very long time. So the federal government has had responsibility to create plans to try to bring the fish back. So they've created recovery plans, and recovery plans require biological opinions. And the opinions are when you have a system such as the Columbia that has a lot of dams, and activities are proposed on it to try to manage salmon, then the opinion is basically how they're going to try to do that, whether there's any jeopardy or not. And the bottom line is there have been 5 biological opinions written over the last 20 years, and every one of them has been rejected in the courts as not scientifically sound. And then they get kicked back to the federal government to redo them so that they are scientifically supportable. And it just hasn't happened. And so that's contributed to kind of the long, slow decline. Been frustrating. Well, one came out in 2020. We were hopeful, but it ended up being a huge disappointment. The preferred alternative was leave all the dams in place and use more spill. And even the plan itself recognized that would help, but it wasn't going to lead to recovery. So it kind of essentially dooms Idaho salmon and steelhead to extinction, given the trajectories we're seeing for their population abundances right now. And it certainly will and has gone back to the courts. And unless they come up with something more viable, it'll be rejected as scientifically unsound again. So we're in kind of a loop, and it needs to stop. And there's several things that are going forward right now to try to deal with that. One of them, of course, is the Simpson Plan, which doesn't look like it's getting much traction, but it certainly started a regional dialogue. And Chris, when he was here last week, referred to the current review that's happening with Senator Murray and Governor Inslee in Washington, looking at the impacts and offsets if the lower Snake River dams were taken out. We're expecting that report in July. And a lot of us are kind of nervous but hopeful about that at the same time. We'll see where that takes us. But in the meantime, we've spent probably $18 billion now on fish and wildlife restoration since the Northwest Power Act went into effect in 1981. And what all of the Snake River, all the anadromous fish in the Snake River are listed under ESA and remain at high risk of extinction. So we're not getting anywhere. Another concern that's been in the news a lot lately is the effect of Snake River and Columbia River Chinook on sustaining the southern resident population of the killer whales. There's 2 populations of killer whales that live off the west coast. There's a northern population and a southern resident population. The northerns live kind of from Alaska down to essentially middle of Vancouver Island, and the southerns live from a little above Vancouver Island all the way down to California. And they feed almost exclusively on salmon which are coming out of the whole West Coast, but particularly the Columbia River, going out to sea. And then when the salmon come back, they typically come across into the Alaska area and then move down. So you get successive waves of Chinook moving down the West Coast. And the waves represent the different life histories in Chinook. You get fall Chinook, summer Chinook, spring Chinook, and so forth. And those waves of Chinook arrive at different timings. And the orcas, this particular population of orcas are salmon specialists and almost exclusively Chinook specialists. And so what it boils down to now is that as the Chinook numbers have fallen, particularly the spring, summer, there's about a 6 to 8 week window when the orcas are out of food. And we saw the results of that a couple years ago when the one whale had a calf that passed away, and she pushed it around for 17 days. And it was on the news a lot. It was really a sad thing. But so the Chinook are critical to the continued maintenance of the killer whale population too. So how do we rebuild Snake River salmon? Well, the very obvious thing is we got to get their SARs up about 4 times more than they are. We got to get them up in the 4% range. And how can we do that? We have to take actions to address outside basin factors. So here's what happens outside the basin. You have the ocean, which productivity fluctuates. We have the Snake and Columbia River migration corridor. We have the estuary, and we have hydro. And then the red stars indicate places that we can do some things. We can work on the migration corridor, improving access, reducing mortality. We can work on rebuilding habitats in the estuary. And a lot of exciting work is being done reconnecting floodplains in the estuary. And we can work on the hydro system. We're using spill right now to try to reduce the impacts of passage and so forth. But the bottom line, we can recover Idaho salmon and steelhead. We have unique stocks that exist in core wilderness habitat that are presently at very high risk of extirpation. Within basin actions are not sufficient to recover them. Outside basin actions are essential. And if restored, wild Idaho salmon steelhead may be uniquely adapted to buffer versus a changing climate. There's been a couple of really nice articles that have talked about the habitat in Idaho as a climate shield. Most of the habitat that the Chinook and steelhead go back to is in federally protected national forests and wilderness areas, and it's at high elevation. So it's buffered by temperature-wise. So the problem is just getting them there. So what are the next steps? Well, I think we can take a structured approach to recovery of Snake River Basin salmon by decreasing mortality through the hydro system, increase the productivity of wild fish, decrease interactions between wild fish and hatchery fish, where we have a very large body of scientific evidence now that shows there are negative consequences of that, and to create wild salmon and steelhead sanctuaries where possible. How do we decrease mortality through the hydro system? Well, the obvious one, and that was the point of Chris Wood's visit last week, was we need to focus on removing the 4 lower Snake River dams. We also need to increase spill at the 4 Columbia River dams below that, as we know that works. But we also know that that in and of itself is not sufficient to recover salmon and steelhead. What's the case against the lower Snake River dams? So here's more Chinook data, and it compares the Snake River, the fish that pass through 8 dams, versus those that are downriver that pass through 3 dams. And you can see the lines start out similar back here in the 50s and 60s. Remember, the lower Snake dams kind of went in from the 60 through about 75. And you can see these lines diverge. The downriver survival index stays pretty high, and the Snake River stocks start to plummet. And again, this is data from Howard Schaller and Charlie Petrosky and others. Very powerful. There's the sequence and the time frame that the dams went in. And so you can see starting to diverge right in here, and with 6, 7, and 8, the divergence really takes off. Here's a really busy slide. When we teach students how to make slides, we tell them not to do this, but this is a capture of a slide from the Nez Perce tribal analysis in 2021 of 24 Chinook, Snake River Chinook and steelhead populations. These are all Chinook. from different locations. And where things go red, the fish are in trouble. And this is a thing called a quasi-extinction threshold alarm. It sounds really, the quasi-extinction part of it is a fancy term. What it basically means is the population falls below about 50 fish, at which point some genetic factors on inbreeding, loss of diversity, and other things start to accelerate, and the population gets more and more into trouble. So they're not extinct, but it's an alarm call that they're on the verge of it. And the analysis shows that presently 42% of spring summer Chinook are at or below QET. And by 2025, 77% of the populations will be at the quasi-extinction threshold. Here's a slide that I did a lot of work on SARs and dams over the last couple of years, and Helen Neville and the crew at Trout Unlimited took a lot of the stuff that I'd been tinkering with, and came up with this fabulous slide. Here's wild spring and summer Chinook in orange and summer steelhead in green bar graphs. Again, we're back to the dams, the number 2, 3, and 4, which would be the Dalles, John Day, and McNary, and 8, Lower Granite, showing you the replacement levels in the SARs and the recovery goals. So in the mid to late 1860s, with 5 dams in place, Snake River Spring and Chinook SARs ranged from 3 to 6.5%. Today, they're a quarter of that, and they're below the maintenance threshold. If we look at the same slide, you can see that there's a pretty linear trend for the summer steelhead and a pretty linear trend for the Chinook. And if we play with that a little bit and say, okay, what happens if we take 4 dams out? There's kind of where we are. And you can see from the trend lines and from that blue oval, at least conceptually, if we took the 4 Snake River dams out, these SARs that are down below the maintenance will move up into above maintenance and nearing some of the rebuilding goals, particularly for steelhead. So that's encouraging. Those are the expected SAR responses for steelhead and Chinook when or if the lower Snake dams are removed. Increased focus on wild fish production. We need to decrease negative interactions with hatchery origin fish. Well, the first way to start is simply to reduce the number of hatchery fish that are in the system, and particularly to reduce them in locations and places where they interact and interbreed with wild fish. Much easier said than done, because the basin and the agencies have a huge investment in the hatchery programs and also the revenue stream that those programs bring into them in terms of facilities and jobs and so forth. So it's far from a trivial objective. And then finally, create wild salmon and steelhead sanctuaries at the watershed level. We've never really done that. We have a few of them. Actually, we have, we have the John Day, which is a sanctuary more or less. In other words, hatchery fish aren't in it. And the Middle Fork of the Salmon is one too. So we also need to decrease the overall releases of hatchery fish. Get 30 million hatchery smolts going out. Here's a graph showing you wild versus hatchery, Snake River steelhead, and the SARs of adults coming back. So you can see they're both down in trouble. But what you can see is that this peak right here, the green color, are the wild fish. And what this tells us, their numbers are far fewer than the hatchery fish. They're about maybe a tenth of that to a fifth of it. But they perform better. So the wild fish perform better, even though there are fewer of them. So 80% of our runs are of hatchery origin. This is important for tribal rights and for harvest. However, generally hatchery fish have lower survival, reduced fitness, and wild fish are required by ESA to be recovered. But both hatchery and wild fish need a restored migration corridor. Hatchery fish performance-wise, in terms of numbers of fish we release, like with steelhead, we release about 10 steelhead smolts for every wild smolt that goes out. When we get adult returns, we get about 6 hatchery fish back to every wild fish. Those difference in that 10 and 6 tells you right there that the wild fish are surviving and performing better than the hatchery fish. Spring Chinook, again, it's about 6 to 1. So the hatchery fish get lower SARs, don't perform as well. And where wild and hatchery fish breed together, it lowers the genetic fitness of the wild stock, which is a concern. So here's from Hans Rodke. He's worked for the council quite a bit, natural resource economist. Hatcheries were originally established to mitigate for dams that affect salmon migration. Raising salmon in hatcheries is expensive, and it may cost more than the benefits derived. There's not been a lot of economic analyses of hatcheries, but they don't stand up very well. And his point here is investment in habitat improvements and restoration may create more economic benefits than hatcheries. There have been a couple of studies that have recently come out of Scotland and the River Dee and a few systems over there that show that. And so it's worth thinking about that. And then finally, Kyle Young is a fellow back east who's given a lot of thought to hatcheries. And he basically contends that hatcheries and their use is largely a social issue and a social, political, and economic issue rather than a biological one. And he came up with a list of 7 H's to help explain our continued reliance on using hatcheries to solve salmon production problems. I found this pretty interesting. Kyle's a kind of a big thinker. Habit, it's what we know. High, it makes us feel good and useful because hatcheries are producing something we can look at and point to. Hubris, we cannot resist using technological interventions to solve ecological problems. I understand that. It's easier to go do something than it is to stand back and let the fish try to interact with the habitat. Because that seems like we're not doing anything. Honor, no one likes to admit being wrong. Hope, blind faith sees no evidence. There's a lot of evidence that hatcheries don't work the way they were promised to work, and that hatchery fish can have negative impacts on wild fish. But the evidence hasn't so far changed much of our use of hatcheries or belief in them. Heresy, the cynical dismissal of credible scientific evidence of the failure of hatcheries. Well, that comes up in phrases like, well, that might have happened over there, but it's not happening here. And then finally, the H-index, scientific publication, just saying, science, it gives scientists a chance to publish and so forth by doing studies on that. Sanctuaries, create some wild salmon and steelhead sanctuaries. They need to occur at the watershed level. Existing salmon sanctuaries, John Day, Middle Fork of the Salmon, the Selway Locksaw systems. Others, I'm certainly open to ideas on what others might be and would welcome any suggestions for candidate systems. And then finally, we talked a little bit about Representative Simpson's plan. I was really excited when I saw it. I thought it was the biggest view and largest vision for salmon recovery I'd seen in over 30 years of working on it. It's been disappointing to see that it hasn't gotten any traction. It's been particularly disappointing to see none of the other Idaho political leaders, our senators or representatives or governors, stand up for it. But right now it seems to have kind of fed into the Washington's Governor Inslee and Senator Murray impact study that we're waiting for. What's next? And then one of the questions, of course, is how long is this going to take and how much time do the fish have left? Those are questions I don't have the answer for at this point, but they're worth asking. And that's the marathon sprint through all of that data. So at this point, I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Man, Rick, thanks. That's dense, but super important to know. And I thought that was a great walkthrough of kind of the science behind what a lot of us might feel. But really, it gives us a lot of an arsenal to pull from. We'll start with one question. This is from Andy. And Andy, I may need you to clarify, but it says, within Idaho, which salmon populations are more at risk from climate change, I'm guessing? Will the higher elevation populations fare relatively better?
The bottom line is we don't really know, but in theory, the higher elevation populations should fare better, assuming the habitats of equal quality between those populations and their habitat and the lower elevation populations. But when we think about lower populations, so we're really talking about fall Chinook. They're down in the main stem, Clearwater, and Hell's Canyon and everything. And the summers and springs go up into the high elevation. Those are the ones that go up to McCall and into the Sea Sash, Johnson Creek, and of course the salmon and some of the Clearwater. The Clearwater is a little lower elevation, so there may be some more impacts there, but they kind of verge onto Fall Chinook in the lower part and then into some summers. So
Awesome. And now, guys, now is the time for questions. So shoot the gauntlet, and now is the time to put them out there, no matter what your questions are, whether they're directly to one of the slides that we just showed. But I had a question, Rick, and this is something that I'm curious what someone with your level of experience might say. But a lot of us are really excited to see what seems to be a higher run than the last couple of years coming across the dams. How do you sort of respond to folks that are excited for those greater runs, and maybe I can imagine how that could be distracting in the narrative with the fluctuations of runs, and how do you sort of respond to the that sort of excitement and crescendo of energy when they see these increases like we're having potentially right now?
I use a little bit of an oxymoron, probably with cynical optimism, I'd have to say, if that makes any sense. Of course, I'm as excited as anybody to think we have more fish coming back than we've had the last couple of years. But to think that we had anything to do with it or much to do with it doesn't usually prove out. And it could just as easily go right back down the following year. That's the scary part.
Yeah.
And of course, any kind of increase, particularly if it's larger, someone's going to point to and claim credit for. And that just isn't true. We have to do some really large system level things to make a difference.
That's awesome. Appreciate that. I know that's a question I would love to be able to field better in my own personal life. Ken asked a good question. He said, and this is really pertinent. I really love the options that you went through tonight. If nothing changes, how long would you suspect that these runs could sustain? And I guess like in a little bit of an addendum that I'll add, like I saw, you shared some of those numbers for risk of extinction. I forget the exact acronym, excuse me, but that sort of level. But do we have a timeline that we would need to get started on this based on your understanding of what that process might be to, in a healthy way, remove those dams?
Well, we can't spend 20 to 30 years talking about taking the dams out. The fish don't have that time. Russ Thoreau was interviewed by the New York Times earlier this year, and he thought that wild Chinook, and that's Russ's main focus, in Idaho have 25 to 50 years left. And it's hard to argue with when you look at the trend lines and the numbers.
Excellent. I appreciate that. I think you were pretty thorough, Rick. Honestly, do we have any questions out there that we want to get out there? Now is the time, and I know that we're looking down the barrel of a new season here, and would really love to equip all of our members and interested parties that are viewing from different clubs. And I appreciate I can see quite a few names from different fishing clubs and groups and NGOs from around the Treasure Valley and the state too. So I really appreciate all you guys tuning in. So we will, oh, here we go. We got a good one. Chris asked why harvest no longer makes a difference in long-term viability of salmon runs. Why harvest no longer makes a difference in long-term viability of salmon runs. I'm not sure
I quite get that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe Chris, if you could reword that. I'm not sure if we're tracking on that. But I'm gonna Chris.
Well, I mean, there was a news release yesterday or today about the increased spring Chinook numbers coming back, and Joe DuPont from the Clearwater jumped right in and said, that's all great news, and we may be able to have up to 5,000 fish harvested. And I'm kind of going, yeah, but why would we? I mean, so a lot of I'm also, part owner and Idaho angler, and I've been a fly casting instructor for decades. I'm the only master two-hand instructor in southern Idaho, and I do a lot of teaching of spey casting and two-hand rods. I'm down in the river multiple times a week, usually teaching. I haven't been up and fished for steelhead with a two-handed rod in 5 years, even though I've got a two-hand rod in my hand all the time. That was last year. I didn't go, but I thought about cutting the hook off and just going up and skating flies so I could at least get a tug maybe. But
Yeah,
I
I've
can't,
talked to a few guys, a bunch of
can't rationalize going up and trying to catch the last fish in the river.
yeah.
And it has that kind of a feel to it. So, I mean, that's me personally. I'm preaching a little bit, but to take it back to what Chris Wood said last week, Jim Likatowicz and I have written a lot of scientific papers. We put them in symposium and journals, and we've shifted our writing over the last decade to writing more for the public and the general public, the educated public. And the reason we're doing it is that we're not finding that the science papers have had, even though they've created a great track record, people rely on them, they haven't really impacted policy and public opinion the way that we think they should. And so we've started to focus our writing for the public, trying to sway more public opinion and get more public involvement. And that was kind of the bottom line of Chris Wood's talk last week, is that none of our Idaho politicians have stood up except for Mike Simpson. And we're seeing what appears to be, it comes off as a lack of courage. Because I've talked to Mike Crapo's chief of staff for years, and he's assured me that Crapo's always going to be there for wild salmon and steelhead, but it's not happening. And so it's time, maybe we have to help them through public pressure find the courage they need to stand up for the fish so that we don't lose them. So that's one thing we can do.
Couldn't agree more, and I love that personal responsibility anecdote, and really looking at what each and every angler can offer. And there are things that can be done, and we did share in the bottom of the screen. I think you can see it, Rick. There is an action item through to you. This is the same action item that Chris shared during last week's event, and whether it's through NEPA processes or through public opinions, or the influence of constituents does sway the actions of politicians. Their job is to get reelected. And so the opinion of their constituents matter. And TU has a great offer that's linked there in that banner scrolling across your screen to take action. And don't let it be the last, but I would encourage you to make it your first. And taking that first step is a great way to personally take action. And I don't see any other.
Well, I see from Andy. I think what.
Oh yeah, there we go.
What Chris may be asking is, can harvest really impact these populations? And at one level, I kind of understand. Probably not, because there's always compensatory mortality and some of the fish die. But so maybe low levels of harvest don't impact these populations. But you're not going to catch all hatchery fish, and so you're going to catch some wild fish. And even as careful as we are as fly anglers, there's mortality associated with that. And I don't want to be killing a wild fish, not in this day and age. So, not a wild steelhead or a wild Chinook. So. That's my own take on it.
Sure, and I think the range of personal options there to partake in, there's a certain level of conscientiousness that if we are aware of your impact and we're thinking conservation first, then we are light years ahead of where a large number of anglers are today, and where a large number of voters and advocates are today. And so keeping that in your day-to-day and not exclusively when you're on the river. Ken's actually got another question in here. Do the downstream catch rates have a big impact on I'm thinking Idaho's returns, and what can be done to help change that? So maybe looking at the impacts of the downriver.
Well, clearly harvest occurs both in the Alaska troll fishery and then downstream in the gill nets and so forth. They are ESA controlled by take. Clearly our fish would be better off if there weren't the fish harvested purposely or inadvertently as bycatch in those systems. So kind of an equivocal answer, but yeah, there's an impact there. Absolutely.
There's been a lot of great news coming out. Actually, it seems like a lot of the British Columbia fisheries are really having some public awareness and sort of real scientific research on the impacts that and not to dogmatize, or I'm not writing these reports, but they are looking and analyzing the impacts that some of the Alaskan fisheries are having on those. But there's a lot of, at least we'll call it interesting data out there on the impacts of ocean and downriver that are coming back in here. So Ken,
Yeah, I think the assumption in the last few years is that those impacts have not been very big, but those are starting to be questioned pretty heavily right now. And I think the consensus is that they're greater impacts than we thought. One thing I would suggest, if people really are interested, is go look at the website for the Wild Fish Conservancy out of Seattle. It's one of the best NGOs around. They're real strong advocates. And one of the things they're promoting right now very strongly is a new harvest system for in-river harvest, and it's called a fish trap or a pound net. It's based on historical Native American systems where essentially a weir is put out on one of the banks of the Columbia, Washington or Oregon side, that has a little bit of a J shape to it, and fish swim into it, guides them into a trap where they're kept underwater, and then that trap can be raised up without the fish ever being taken out of the water, and you can sort hatchery fish from wild fish and release the hatchery fish directly back into the system to migrate further upstream without even handling them or minimal handling. And then you can collect the hatchery origin fish as part of that targeted fishery. And there's a bunch of folks that are doing it now. Some of the Indian folks who've been gill netters in the past are starting to adopt this, and they're able to take those hatchery fish that they're catching low in the river, that before they're turning any color, they're very high quality, and feed them right into a high-end commercial and restaurant market, getting more money for it too. And so, and there's been a couple of published scientific papers that show the mortality associated with these pound nets or fish traps is virtually minimal, almost non-existent. And so and some of the, right now we're seeing there's been inquiries to the Wild Fish Conservancy about these, and purchases for them to be built. A few by state agencies, more by some of the tribes, including up into British Columbia. They're switching to these systems as a way to selectively harvest the hatchery origin fish that are in that system and to release the wild fish upstream for escapement. It's great news.
That is great news, and that's fascinating. I haven't personally heard about that, and I'd like to dig in a little bit more on that. Rick, let's wrap it up with that. Really appreciate this. I know that I learned a lot. I'm sure the rest of us did too. I'm going to end it with a bit of on that note of kind of technology and new innovation. Aaron Lieberman, who is the head of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association, had a great quote in a random meeting that was videotaped. I think it was a couple of years ago now, where he said, "We have done difficult and expensive things before, and we can do them again." And I think innovations that, just like Rick just offered, that quote in that moment and that anecdote really rings with me. And I think we can all keep that in mind as we go. Really appreciate every one of you coming to not only this talk, but all of the talks over the summer as we converted through this tail end of COVID. Daryl, we're going to add you back onto the screen here just to share. Just wondered if there's anything that we wanted to kind of add to wrap it up. But Rick, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who attended last week for Chris's talk. And make sure you check out that Take Action page. Can't encourage you enough.
Daniel, I can send you a couple of PDF papers too if people want to read further.
Please do. If you want to flow them my way, we can distribute them as best we possibly can. Yeah, and if there's anybody out there, you have my email now because I listed it earlier. Reach out to me, and we'll make sure that we connect you in all the ways that we possibly can. And I put links to your and Jim's book in the comments too as well. So I've read them all, and I will personally recommend them. But if you don't trust me, there are millions of others that have read them for decades.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all about it. This is obviously an issue that's been very close to my heart for a long time. It's exceedingly frustrating that we can't seem to get further with it, but I kind of remain an eternal optimist, and I know many of you share that approach. I appreciate it.
Well, we want to carry the torch that you lit met long ago, and folks before you, and we cross as many finish lines as we can possibly
Thanks,
imagine.
Daniel, Daryl, Andy, and Jane. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you, Rick.
All right. I think that's it, everybody. Have a good summer.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to run into you on a stream somewhere.
Be all fishing.
For sure.
Till next time.
Thanks.